Hello and welcome to today's lesson. It is on reproductive isolation and macroevolution. And yes, congratulations on making it to the final video of Unit 3 and 4. And for the Year 12's, the last biology video ever. Congratulations. Let's get into it. From QCAA, the learning goal for today's lesson is to understand that the differential mechanisms of isolation, geographic, including environmental disasters, habitat fragmentation, reproductive, spatial, and temporal, they all influence gene flow. And lastly, to recall that speciation and macroevolutionary change result from an accumulation of microevolutionary changes over time. So here you can pause the video and write down your own version of those learning goals now. Okay, let's get into it. First up, we have mechanisms of isolation. And the learning goal was to understand that there's different types, but how they all influence gene flow. So what does it mean to understand? From QCAA, it means to perceive what is meant by something, to grasp, be familiar with, construct meaning from messages, including oral, written, and graphic communication. Let's do it. So from last week, we spoke about speciation. And speciation is the formation of one or more new species from a current species. In order for two populations to be different species, though, they must not be able to share their genetic information with the rest of the species. And this is what we call reproductive isolation. But before we get into the two main types of reproductive isolation, let's zoom out for a moment and let's go over asexual reproduction as opposed to sexual reproduction. So in asexual reproduction, we have one parent, such as a bacterium, and it will divide into two genetically identical daughter cells. And we say this has low genetic diversity. Whereas in sexual reproduction, we have two members of the same species. They reproduce with each other to produce a unique offspring. And we say this has high genetic diversity. So today, when we talk about how different organisms can reproduce with each other or not, we're just talking in terms of sexual reproduction. So when we talk about reproductive isolation, we're talking about the many factors that can stop organisms from having offspring together. And as I said before, there are two main types. There's two main categories. They are prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. And it's named for whether these barriers occur before or after fertilization. So, prezygotic barriers refer to all the factors that prevent two organisms from having offspring together prior to the formation of a zygote. That is before fertilization can occur. And a zygote is simply a fertilized egg cell. So the first type of prezygotic barrier is temporal. And temporal refers to time. It occurs when two species mate at different times of year. The example being frogs live in the same pond, but maybe they breed during different seasons. As temporal refers to time, it can also just mean different times of day. So a species that mates in the day as opposed to a different species at night are said to be temporally isolated. Secondly, we have ecological. And this refers to organisms that prefer to mate in different places. The example being lions and tigers, they can potentially interbreed, but usually occupy different habitats, so are thus reproductively isolated. Next, we have behavioral isolation, and it refers to how organisms go about attracting a mate in different ways. So certain groups of birds will only respond to species-specific mating calls. And then lastly, we have mechanical isolation. And this is when there are structural or physical barriers that prevent species from interbreeding with each other. And certain breeds of dog are morphologically incapable of mating due to size. Not all breeds, and we're going to talk about that a little later on. So that is all for prezygotic barriers. Then we have postzygotic forms of isolation, and this is where mating occurs, but the offspring are not viable or they're sterile. So the first being hybrid inviability, and it's when hybrids are produced but fail to develop to reproductive maturity. And certain types of frogs from hybrid tadpoles form hybrid tadpoles that die before they can become a frog. Next, we have hybrid infertility, and it's hybrids that fail to produce functional gametes. So the classic example is when a horse and a donkey mate. They produce offspring, the mule, but the mule is unable to produce its own offspring. It's said to be sterile. And lastly, we have hybrid breakdown. And this refers to when offspring is produced and can reproduce. However, the second generation is usually very weak or even sterile itself. So, if two sexually reproducing organisms are not inhibited by any of these barriers, then we can generally say they are members of the same species. It is also known that reproductive isolation between members of the same species can over time result in the variance of that one species, and thus the formation of a new species. But if we go back to our learning goal, up the top here, it says to talk about geographic isolation and how this can influence gene flow. And I just want to make a link back to a previous lesson where we spoke about population bottlenecks. So this refers to perhaps natural disasters or human impact. Whatever it is occurs reduces the population size significantly, thus reducing genetic information within that population. So that is an example of how gene flow can be influenced as well by geographic factors. And that is all for mechanisms of isolation. So let's move on again. We're now talking about macroevolution, and the goal is to recall that speciation and macroevolutionary change results from an accumulation of microevolutionary changes over time. To recall, it means to remember, to present remembered ideas, facts, or experiences, to bring something back into thought, attention, or into one's mind. So the purpose of this part of the video is really just to go over some definitions together. So let's begin with evolution. Evolution is defined as biological change over time. And this can occur due to four main reasons. The first being natural selection. That is when environmental pressures, for example, lead to particular traits being favored, selected, or not, and how that can cause biological change. Secondly, we have genetic mutation. And a mutation is a random and permanent change in the genetic code of an organism that may result in a selective advantage for that particular species. And that too is said to be able to cause biological change over time. Thirdly, we have gene flow. That is genes flowing in and out of a population. How can this occur? Well, simply, for example, immigration and emigration. Fourthly, genetic drift can cause biological change. And that is the change in allele frequency in a population over time. How does allele frequency change? Well, because of gene flow. And again, the example of immigration and emigration can be used there. So that is evolution. Let's be a bit more specific now though and break down a couple of other key terms. Microevolution refers to biological change over time within a species. That is changes, for example, in DNA sequences and allele frequencies within a species, generally over a shorter period of time. Observable instances of microevolution, for example, is how bacteria develop antibiotic resistance. Microevolution is said to lead to speciation. That is how we saw last week the development of a new species through a couple of different modes. The three main being allopatric, sympatric, and parapatric. So speciation through microevolution is said to be what provides the raw materials, as in drives macroevolution. And macroevolution refers to biological change over time, not within, but at or above the level of species. So the definition has widely varied over time. But in the modern sense, macroevolution is evolution, that is change, that is guided by selection, mutation, and speciation at or above the species level. For this to occur, it generally happens over geological time, that being millions or billions of years. In contrast with microevolution, macroevolution reflects large-scale changes at or above the species level, which result from the accumulation of numerous small changes on the microevolutionary scale. Now, according to nature.com, an example of macroevolution is the evolution of a new species, which according to this definition, you can read about in the textbook, the speciation of simply a new finch species as observed on the Galapagos Islands falls under the definition of macroevolution. This, though, does not and did not take geological time. So therefore, the other extent of macroevolution by the modern definition, it includes short-term finch A to finch B, but it also includes molecules to man type of macroevolution, species to species, kind to kind. Thus, it is important to distinguish between terms as there are major differences in what is simply observed and what is not observed that still come within the same definition of macroevolution. So let's talk about some examples of micro and macro now. All the different dog breeds that have descended from their common ancestor, the grey wolf, or most, are still able to interbreed. The Chihuahua and the Great Dane, for example, they can still produce viable offspring. So by this definition, all dogs are of the same species, that is Canis lupus familiaris, as they're all descendants from the common grey wolf. And therefore the variation that we have seen in all the different dog species take place between them is within the same species, and that therefore is microevolution, whereby a male finch that immigrated to the mainland, as you read about in the textbook, is an example of macroevolution. So let me talk about that. You'll read about in the textbook in the 1970s how Peter and Rosemary Grant observed the formation of a new species, and that's this one pictured right there, whereby a male finch immigrated to the island, a drought occurred, and the descendants from the surviving line no longer mated with the other finches on the island. Thus, the formation of a new species was formed. And by the modern definition, this is an example of macroevolution. So we have microevolution within a species as we observe with the common grey wolf and all the variations of descendants that have come from it. But macroevolution, which we can observe here according to this definition within this particular finch, but at or above the species level, well, that also refers to what we call molecules to man evolution, whereby marine animals evolve, change, adapt into reptiles, into mammals, and into Homo sapiens. So it's important to know what kind of things we're talking about when it comes to our definitions. So this slide has covered evolution, referring to biological change over time, microevolution, referring to biological change within a species, and macroevolution, changes at or above the species level. And that is all for content as far as this video goes. So I'm now going to move on to a couple of quotes to finish up. We have this one. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble. Cool quote by this man, Albert Einstein. Now, as we move on, and as the sun sets on this season of biology, and as it will rise on, no doubt, another chapter in all of our lives, I will say that my mission has always been to simply introduce you to the world of biology in an engaging and in a tangible way. As we have recently discussed the field of evolution, it has been my mission to present you with various sides of understanding and of belief so that you may in turn come to your own place of understanding and belief. I certainly have, but I did not come to it based on what I was taught at university or what I ever have read in a textbook. But I believe through listening to the greatest teacher in the greatest classroom, and that being creation. And so my final message to you, biology students, is to, as you come to your own place of understanding and belief, don't forget to get outside, to put the book down, to look up, because it is a beautiful world that is made by a beautiful God. And that is why I love biology, and I hope that you now do too. God bless. I'll see you in class.